Welcome back, everybody. I'm Professor G. What I want to do for this video is I want to give you a very brief introduction to Christianity as a sort of a complement to our discussion about ancient Rome, just to provide you with some context as far as the religion, as far as the philosophy, as far as how all this goes. So, with Christianity, if we're talking about its historical roots, the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Hegel said that Christianity is a combination of two things. Of first century Judaism on the one hand, of first century Greek philosophy on the other, that these two sort of intellectual worlds meet, they collide, and that out of this collision comes Christianity. So let's talk briefly about both of those really quick, because I think in a general sense, he's kind of right about that. So, first century Greek philosophy. Even though historically Jesus existed under the Roman Empire, even though Israel, not a nation yet, but even though the Jewish people existed under Roman rule, the Romans were culturally Greek. All of the best parts of Roman culture, their art, their, let me rephrase that. Their art, their literature, their philosophy, all of that came from the Greeks. Now, that's not to demean the Romans at all. They were really good at architecture and law. But as far as their intellectual thought went, their non-legal stuff, most of that was taken from the Greeks. So when you're talking about Roman philosophy, you're really talking about Greek philosophy, and there's always some exceptions, and there's some exceptions there as well. But Christianity really arises out of this Greek tradition. And so when we're talking about Greek philosophy, you've read some Plato, and I think that I've talked about Aristotle before. But the Greek philosophical tradition that's going to most influence Christianity is going to be Plato, is going to be this Platonic type thinking. So much so that one of the early words and concepts that these Christians use, the logos, the idea of the logos is taken straight from Plato's philosophy. The logos as this rational, creative force at work in the universe comes from Plato's Timaeus. But by this time you have several other schools as well. So you have the Platonic school, you have the Aristotelian school, but you also have the Stoic school. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, is a Stoic. And you have the Epicureans. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these aren't just ways of viewing and understanding the world. It's not like you go to history class and you're a part of this you're going to school for history. These Greek schools are really sort of ways of life. One of the early Christian apologists, Justin Martyr, tells us that you could physically, visibly pick out a Platonist from a crowd of people based on their appearance, based on what they wear and how they acted in public. Like, this wasn't just books that people read. This was really an entire way of living, an entire way of believing. And you can see, so we've talked about Platonism and Aristotelianism. Stoicism is this belief that it's the belief that the emotions ought to be kept under control. Both Stoicism and Epicureanism are it's ethics, all right, and ethics concerns how you should live your life. So Stoicism and Epicureanism is about how we ought to live. Stoicism says that reason is what you should be striving for. It's the pinnacle of human existence, and that the emotions are bad because the emotions make you irrational. So the Stoics believed that the good man, the ethical man, is sort of the person who remained calm in stressful situations, who applied this rational, reasonable attitude to everything in life and viewed everything in light of reason. And the Epicureans often miscategorized, misclassified as hedonists, as pleasure seekers. Epicurus really taught not hedonism, but that the goal of life was the avoidance of pain, right? It's not necessarily that you should go out and seek as much pleasure as you want to, right? Because if I'm a hedonist, maybe I stay up all night drinking. But of course, as you know, if you've ever done that before, not saying that I have, but if you've ever done that before, it doesn't feel so great the next morning, right? So Epicurus thought and taught that the goal of life was the freedom from pain, not seeking pleasure. Anyway, the Stoics believed that the world was ordered through reason, that the world was built through reason, and that there is this principle, this idea that embodies reason, and that idea is the logos. And early Christian thinkers are going to start to pick up on this and start to utilize this within their theology. And you see this from the get-go. You actually see this in the Gospel of John, right? First chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. That word, sorry, it's kind of confusing. The word in Greek is logos. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God. The logos was with God in the beginning. Now, if a Stoic heard that, alarm bells would start going off. Oh yeah, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about logos. Okay, I see what you're doing there. You can actually see this also in the New Testament when the disciple Paul goes to Athens and he's delivering his sermon and he's preaching to who? You can look it up. It's right there in Acts. He's preaching to the Epicureans and the Stoics. And so Paul is starting to use Greek lingo. He's starting to use philosophical concepts in order to relate Christianity to the Greeks and to the Roman world, to try to make Christianity make sense within that context. And it's going to almost have a reverse effect, because Christian concepts and ideas Christianity is slowly going to move away from Judaism and really start to incorporate and embody Greek thought. So that's the first influence, is first century Greek philosophy. But the second influence is first century Judaism, first century Jewish religious thought. And there are three major sects within first century Judaism. The first and most prominent, the most popular, are the Pharisees. And you see the Pharisees throughout the New Testament. The Pharisees are the guys that Jesus is constantly clashing with, right? The Pharisees are the ones that are constantly trying to kill Jesus, and Jesus is calling them a brood of vipers, right? Those are the Pharisees. And the reason why there's this clash is, ironically, is because this is the type of Judaism that influences Christianity the most. The Pharisees are a populist religion, meaning that most common first century Jews, like the common everyday person, was probably going to be a Pharisee. It's a popular religion. It taught popular concepts like an afterlife. It taught the atonement from sin. It taught, you even have primitive forms of baptism, and you actually see this with John, not the disciple, but you see sort of evidence of this within the Gospels themselves. So the Pharisees, but it's a temple religion. It's centered on and around the temple. The temple is where you make sacrifices at. Temple, of course, being located in Jerusalem. And of course, within Judaism, the temple is literally the house of God. It's where Yahweh's presence, where Yahweh himself dwells. So the Pharisees, sort of the religion of the masses. Most Jewish people at that time were Pharisees. But then you also had the Sadducees. And the Sadducees typically consisted of the richer Jewish people, okay, socially speaking. And the Sadducees were the ones usually in charge of the temple. Usually a lot of the temple priests were Sadducees. Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. Cheesy Sunday school joke here. The Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. That's why they were so sad, you see. Sorry, I had to do that. Please forgive me. So the Sadducees consisted of the wealthier Jewish people, the ones in charge of the temple. The Pharisees, the more popular, most Jewish people were Pharisees. But there's evidence of other different small groups as well. And we know this, for example, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls being preserved by a group of religious Jews known as the Essenes. And the Essenes were a bit like a cult, not like a Jim Jones type cult, but they're like a end of the world cult. The Essenes believe that the Messiah is coming, and this was a fairly popular idea, especially by the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees did also believe that a Messiah was coming in order to free them from Roman rule. The Essenes did as well, but the Essenes believed that the entire world was going to end, that everything was going to end. The Pharisees believed that the Messiah would come to establish a Jewish state, to establish a free Jewish people. The Essenes just kind of thought everything was going to go to shit. And so they removed themselves from society. And this is the only reason why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably one of the most fantastic archaeological finds of the 20th century, is that the Essenes hid themselves away and they hide these scrolls in these random mountain caves. So it's out of this context, first century Judaism, first century Greek philosophy, these two sort of meet. And it's an uncomfortable meeting at first. But it's really because of this that Christianity emerges. Now, Christianity at first the Christians have an identity crisis. And you can see this especially if you own a Bible, or you're completely free online nowadays, but especially in the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is about the sort of the beginning of the Christian church. And one of probably the biggest dilemma is, well, what are we? Are we Jews? I mean, ethnically speaking, most Christians, right after the death of Jesus, are Jews. They speak Hebrew, they were born in and around Jerusalem, and most of them still practice Judaism. Jesus didn't create a new religion. At least that's not what he set out to do. He set out to reform Judaism. He set out as a reform movement, but like a lot of reform movements, it's from this that we get the establishment of a new religion. So most of these early Christians are Jews. They continue to go to temple. They continue to worship at temple. They continue to view themselves, to abide by the dietary laws, to view themselves as Jews. But you can see this struggle start to emerge, because as Christianity spreads outward, as they start converting more and more people, most of the people they're converting aren't Jews. Most Jewish people say, no, that sounds a bit crazy. I'm not going to believe that. But they start converting more and more Greeks, more and more Greek people, then eventually more and more Roman people. So the question is, well, are we Jewish? And do these new people have to abide by Jewish law? Right? This is a problem that Judaism doesn't really have to face, because Judaism doesn't really proselytize. It doesn't preach. Right? You're not going to go on to a corner on the streets of Savannah and see a Jewish rabbi standing out there throwing the Torah at people. It's not going to happen. But you very well might see a Christian pastor doing that, because Jews, yeah, they're open if you want to become Jewish, sure, right? But they're not going to chase after you like Christian pastors will do. So this question emerges for the central question of the early church is, well, what are we? Are we Jewish? Are we something different? And eventually they decide, well, we're something different. Okay, and the issue here is the Jewish law. What are these new converts to believe? And perhaps most importantly, what are they supposed to be doing? Now, if you've read any of the New Testament, Jesus kind of keeps the law, but he kind of ignores it too. Jesus didn't really see the law as being necessary for salvation. In fact, this is the big collision here between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees emphasized heavy law. If you're Jewish, this is what you do. And they go through the entirety of the law in the Old Testament. And yet, Jesus looks at them and says, "You're sons of Satan." Right? So the disciples are like, well, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Right? But the Pharisees are keeping the law. They're, on the outside, they're good people. They're not eating pork. They're circumcising their children. They're obeying by all the other customary laws. They're doing everything to a T, but that doesn't matter for Jesus. He doesn't really see that as what's necessary for salvation. Right? In fact, one of these Pharisees comes to him and says, I've kept all the laws. I've obeyed my father and my mother, and I do everything else. What else must I do? And what does Jesus tell him? Jesus says, great, sell everything you have to the poor and come follow me. And the guy says, I'm going to pass. And so time and time again, Jesus emphasizes that it's not really what you do. Okay, it's not about your actions. Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. You're nice and you're pretty and you're made out of marble and you're shiny and you're glimmering in the sunlight on the outside, but on the inside, Jesus says, you have dead men's bones. Right? You're a grave. You're a mausoleum. Sure, you look nice, but you don't want to go inside. Right? Because the inside's nasty. It's hollow. It's dead. Okay, so Jesus emphasizes sort of the internal aspects of morality as opposed to the external actions. And so when you start getting these new disciples, when you start getting these new converts to Christianity, the disciples face a dilemma. Well, what are these new converts supposed to be doing? And at first, you stick with some of the Jewish law. You can see this in Acts when they start to get more and more Greek converts. They say, well, keep with some of the dietary laws. Don't eat strangled meat. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. And then there's this really sticky, weird issue of circumcision. And if you don't know what circumcision is, I would tell you to Google it, but don't Google it. At least not with anybody around. Circumcision is when you, and I've had people that don't know this, so I'll go ahead and say it. Circumcision is when you cut off the foreskin of the penis on a child. Okay, typically it's done at birth, right? But you can imagine a 30-year-old man who converts to Christianity, and the disciples say, "Great, now you just got to be circumcised." And the guy says, "Ooh, I think that's a deal breaker." Right? It's kind of that's a hard pitch to convert somebody to a particular religion. Oh yeah, you can come join our church. You just gotta, that little snip. Yeah, most people would pass on that. And so the disciples say, well, we're not gonna push that too much. And so Paul starts to spiritualize this. He says it's not about physical circumcision. It's about circumcision of the heart. Right, you can win some converts with that. You start to fluff it up a bit. That starts to sound a bit better. So the early struggle is, well, are we still Jewish? And so that's resolved. Well, we're not quite Jewish. And so you get the beginning of the Christian church. Well, the next issue they have to struggle with is, how are we going to incorporate, what aspects of Greek thought are we going to bring in? What aspects of Greek thought are we going to accept? And so there's this early debate. Is Greek philosophy a good thing, or is Greek philosophy a bad thing? And you had people on both sides. For example, a second century church father named Tertullian. Tertullian says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? right? Athens is the birthplace of Greek philosophy. Tertullian's a rhetorician, so he's kind of fancy with his words. Athens is the birthplace of Greek philosophy. Jerusalem, the birthplace of the church. And Tertullian, it's a rhetorical question because Tertullian says they have nothing to do with each other. Nothing, right? Greek philosophy doesn't have a place in Christianity. But then you get people like Justin Martyr, who is a Platonist. He belongs to the school of Platonic thought. He goes to the academy. He's enrolled as a student in the academy, and he becomes a Christian. And here's the kicker: he doesn't give up Platonism. He keeps being a Christian and a Platonist. And so Justin Martyr says, well, they're complementary. They help each other. And this battle, this struggle, influences Greek thought, Christian thought as well, and it's resolved in the Council of Nicaea, but I'll save that for the next lecture. See you guys next time. We'll talk about the first church council.